The gate was broken on a Tuesday morning in the autumn of 1883, and Hugh Ralston did not notice until a woman he had never seen before in his life was already halfway through fixing it. He had been standing at the window of his kitchen, drinking coffee that had gone lukewarm while he stared out at nothing in particular, the way a man does when his thoughts have nowhere useful to go, and his heart has long since decided to stop trying. The ranch spread out before him in the gray early light, the pasture brown and frostbitten at the edges, the fence lines running straight and clean the way his father had always insisted they should. Everything was in its proper place. Everything except that gate at the far end of the yard, the one that led from the main property down toward the creek path, the one that had been sagging on its lower hinge for 3 weeks now, and that Hugh had told himself he would get to eventually, when he had the inclination, which so far he had not. There was a woman crouched beside it. Hugh set his coffee cup down slowly, as if any sudden movement might disturb something he had not yet fully processed. She was wearing trousers, which was the first thing that registered, because women in Calhoun County, Texas did not generally go about in trousers, not in 1883, not out in the open in the early morning, with the light just coming up gold over the ridge. She had a canvas coat over her shirt, the kind that working men wore, and her hair was pulled back under a plain hat that had seen considerable weather. She was kneeling in the dirt beside the gate post with what appeared to be a hammer and a short piece of iron, and she was doing something methodical and deliberate with the lower hinge. Hugh watched her for a long moment. He was not a man given to hasty action anymore. He was 34 years old, and he had learned the cost of moving quickly toward things that looked good from a distance. He had learned it in a way that a person does not easily unlearn, the kind of lesson that sits in the chest just below the sternum and makes itself felt on quiet mornings exactly like this one. He put on his hat and walked outside. The autumn air was sharp and smelled of dry grass and the distant promise of rain. The ground crunched slightly under his boots as he crossed the yard, and still she did not look up. She was working with a focused competence that he recognized in someone who knew exactly what they were doing, and she was not hurrying, and she was not performing the work for any audience. She was simply fixing the gate the way it needed to be fixed. He stopped about 10 feet away and watched her drive the new pin through the hinge bracket with 3 clean strikes of the hammer. "That is my gate," he said. "I know it," she said, without looking up. Her voice was clear and unhurried. She tested the hinge with her thumb, pressing against it, checking the tension. Then she stood, and she was taller than he had expected from his kitchen window, her shoulders straight, her hands dusting themselves against the sides of her coat. She swung the gate once-twice, checked that it moved clean and true on both hinges, latched it, opened it, and latched it again. Then she picked up the small canvas bag she had set beside the post, tucked her hammer back into it, and walked past him without a word. Not unfriendly, not hostile. Just purposeful, the way someone walks when they have something else to be getting on with, and pleasantries are a luxury they are not carrying today. He turned and watched her go. She walked down the lane toward the road without looking back, her boots steady on the packed earth, her canvas bag over one shoulder, and within 2 minutes she had turned at the fence line and disappeared from his view entirely. Hugh stood beside his freshly repaired gate for a long time. He thought about calling after her. He thought about asking her name, which seemed the sensible and natural thing to do when a stranger repaired your property without permission or introduction. He thought about several things, standing there in the cooling morning air with the smell of coming rain getting closer. He did none of them. He just stood there, and something happened inside his chest that he had not felt in a very long time, something that started small and quiet and impossible to name, and he did not like it one bit. He went inside and poured his cold coffee out and told himself he was done thinking about it. He was not done thinking about it. Hugh Ralston had come to the ranch at Calhoun County in 1879, 4 years prior, following the end of the worst 2 years of his life. He had grown up in the county, the son of a cattle rancher who had built the Ralston place from nothing but grit and borrowed money, And when his father died in 1876, he had inherited everything: the land and the cattle and the debt and the responsibility. He had also, in the same year, become engaged to a woman named Clara Hennessy, who was the daughter of the bank manager in town, and who had been the most beautiful person Hugh Ralston had ever seen in his life at that point. He had loved Clara Hennessy with the whole and uncritical heart of a man who has not yet been properly broken. He had planned a future with her, the kind that looks very clear and certain when you are 27, and everything ahead seems like it will simply unfold the way you intend. He had been wrong about that, as it turned out. Clara had decided by the spring of 1878 that the ranch life was not for her, and that she had decided it, specifically, with the help of a cattle broker from Austin who came through town on business twice a year, and had considerably more ready cash than Hugh and considerably fewer fences to mend. She had left on a Thursday. She had not left a letter. Hugh had received the news from her father, who had the decency to look ashamed about it, standing on the porch of his bank with his hat in his hands. Hugh had thanked him, because that was what you did, and he had ridden home, and he had spent the better part of a year being very quiet and very alone, and working himself near to exhaustion every single day so that there was no room left in him for anything as impractical as grief. By 1880 he had decided, with a clarity that felt solid and real, that he was finished with that particular business. Not bitterly, he told himself, not with anger. Just with the practical recognition that some men were not built for that kind of thing, or at least he was not, and the sooner he stopped pretending otherwise the better for everyone involved. He had his land. He had his cattle. He had his neighbor Walt Briggs 2 miles up the road, who came over on Sundays sometimes to play cards, and he had the occasional company of the town when business required it. It was enough. He had decided it was enough. The woman with the hammer had threatened that decision in a way that nothing in 3 years had managed, and she had not even told him her name. He rode into Calhoun on Wednesday, which was not his usual day for town, but the hardware store needed paying, and the general store was expecting his monthly account, and there was absolutely no other reason for it. He tied his horse outside Marvell's general store and went in and settled his bill with the proprietor, a round-faced man named Gideon Marvell who had run the store since before Hugh was born and who knew everyone within 30 miles by name, occupation, and most of their notable history. Hugh settled his bill and then, in the most casual voice he could manage, said, "There was a woman came by my property yesterday morning, repaired a gate. I did not get her name." Gideon looked up from his ledger with the mild interest of a man who collects information the way other people collect coins. "What did she look like?" "Tall, canvas coat, trousers, brown hat, dark hair." Gideon nodded slowly in a way that suggested he was placing someone. "That sounds like it might be the Langston woman, Elsie Langston. She came up from San Antonio sometime in the late summer, bought the Devers property on the East Creek Road." "The Devers property," Hugh said. "That has been empty for 2 years. She is fixing it up," Gideon said, with a particular tone that communicated both approval and interest. "She came in here first week of September asking about lumber prices and whether I knew a man who could help her re-roof the barn. I told her I knew 3, and she said she would manage it herself and only needed to know what the lumber would cost per board foot." He paused. "She bought the lumber herself and re-roofed the barn herself. I know because I drove past it last week." Hugh absorbed this information. "She lives alone," he said, and then immediately wished he had phrased that differently, because it was none of his business, and the question had come out with an interest he had not intended to display. "Far as I know," Gideon said, with a look that communicated precisely that he had noted the question and found it interesting. "Langston, Elsie Langston, you could ride over and return the favor, I suppose, seeing as she helped you with your gate." "It was not a favor I asked for," Hugh said. "No," Gideon agreed pleasantly. "I suppose it was not." Hugh bought 2 pounds of coffee and a tin of tobacco he did not actually need and rode home. Elsie Langston. He turned the name over in his mind the way you turn a stone in your hand, feeling the weight of it. It was a straightforward name, a working name. It went with canvas coats and hammers, and doing things yourself without waiting for someone to offer. He thought about the way she had walked away without looking back. He thought about this considerably more than was reasonable for a man who had decided he was finished with all of that. The rain came on Thursday, a good soaking autumn rain that lasted most of the day, and Hugh spent it inside mending leather and going over his cattle ledgers and not thinking about anything in particular. On Friday the sun came back and the ground was soft and golden, and everything smelled of clean, wet earth, and he found himself riding east along the creek road without having made any particular decision about it. The Devers property sat back from the road behind a line of cottonwood trees that had grown tall and thin in the creek bottomland. The old Devers house was a modest structure, 2 rooms and a covered porch, built of cypress planks that had weathered to a silver gray over the years it had stood empty. As he rode up the lane he could see that the barn roof was indeed new, the pine board still pale gold against the older wood of the walls, and the fence line along the lane had been recently repaired and stretched tight. She was in the kitchen garden. It was only a small plot at the side of the house, but she had turned the soil and was working a row with a hoe, her hat pushed back on her head in the warmth of the morning, her sleeves rolled to the elbows. She heard him coming and straightened and watched him ride up without any particular change in her expression, the way someone watches the weather come in, simply noting it. He stopped his horse at the garden fence and took off his hat. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. There was a pause. "You repaired my gate," he said. "The lower hinge was pulling loose from the post. Another week and the whole thing would have been dragging," she said. "I had the iron and the time. I would have gotten to it," he said. She looked at him with steady brown eyes that held neither judgment nor apology. "I know," she said. "I passed it 3 mornings in a row while I was walking the creek path and it bothered me, so I fixed it." "You could have introduced yourself," he said. "I could have," she agreed. "But I was not there to introduce myself. I was there to fix a hinge." It was such a completely reasonable thing to say that he had no immediate response to it. He sat on his horse with his hat in his hand and looked at her, and she looked back at him with the patient expression of someone who has work to finish and is waiting to see whether the conversation has a useful destination. "My name is Hugh Ralston," he said. "The ranch is the Ralston place, about 2 miles west on the creek road." "I know it," she said. "I am Elsie Langston." "I know that too," he said. "Gideon Marvell told me." Something shifted very slightly in her expression, something that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. "That sounds right," she said. "He knows everything." "He does," Hugh agreed. He looked at the garden, the turned soil, the straight rows she had already hoed. "You are planting late in the season." "Winter vegetables," she said. "Turnips, beets, some kale. You can get them in still in central Texas if you do it before the end of October." "I know it," he said. "My mother used to keep a kitchen garden." Another small pause. She waited, holding her hoe, not filling the silence with anything unnecessary. "Is there anything you need?" he said finally. "On the property. I know the Devers place has been empty some years." "The well rope needs replacing," she said, without hesitation, as if she had been keeping a list. "The south fence along the road is good, but the east pasture fence has 3 posts that have rotted at the ground. The root cellar door has warped and does not close properly, and the chimney in the main room draws unevenly, which I suspect is a blockage." She paused. "I will get to all of it." "I have spare well rope," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "I will come by and get it," she said. "I do not want to put you to trouble." "No trouble," he said. "I can bring it over." She considered this with a straightforwardness that was unusual and, he found, refreshing. Most of the social exchanges he was accustomed to had about 4 extra layers of maneuver and consideration in them. She just thought about it and said, "All right. Thank you, Mr. Ralston." "Hugh," he said. Another small pause. "Hugh," she said. He rode home with the morning sun on his back and the feeling in his chest that he had been pointedly ignoring since Tuesday, and it was considerably louder now than it had been before. He talked sternly to himself for most of the ride back. He was a practical man. He was a man who had learned his lesson. He was a man who had work to do and cattle to manage, and absolutely no business letting a pair of steady brown eyes and a properly swung hammer do anything to him whatsoever. He brought the well rope over on Saturday. She was on the roof of the house when he arrived, which he had not expected, inspecting something near the chimney stack with the careful attention of someone who intends to fix what they find. She climbed down from the roof with the ease of a person who has spent time at heights, dusting her hands on her trousers, and thanked him for the well rope with a directness that indicated the thanks were genuine and the transaction complete. He found, however, that he was not immediately inclined to leave. "You said the chimney was drawing badly," he said, looking up at the roof. "There is a partial blockage somewhere in the upper flue, I think," she said. "I can see daylight through it from below, but the draw is off. I was going to clean it from the top. I have a chimney brush," he said, long-handled. She looked at him with that same steady, evaluating look. "You are being very neighborly," she said, and there was a mild dryness in her tone that made it clear she was noting this. "You fixed my gate," he said. "I fixed your gate without being asked and without introducing myself," she said. "You do not owe me anything for that." "No," he agreed. "But I am offering anyway." She considered him for a long moment, and then something in her expression shifted, not much, just a degree or two, like sunlight coming through a cloud at a slightly different angle. "All right," she said. "If you want to be useful, I will not stop you." He brought the chimney brush the following Monday, and they cleared the flue together. Him on the roof with the brush, and she below calling up information about the draw. And by noon, the fireplace was pulling clean and strong, and the kitchen had a warmth to it that she said it had been lacking since she moved in. She made coffee on the newly drawing fire, and they sat at her kitchen table and drank it, and she told him, because he asked, that she had come from San Antonio, where she had been working as a seamstress, and before that on a ranch her father had run outside of Lockhart. "Your father is gone," he said. "2 years ago," she said. "Influenza. My mother went when I was 12. She said it plainly, without inviting pity, just setting down the facts. "I am sorry," he said. "Thank you," she said in the same plain way. "You are running this place alone," he said. "That is the plan," she said. "It is a lot of work for one person." "It is," she said. "I know that, but it is mine." She looked down at her coffee cup and then back up at him, and there was something in her voice that had gone slightly quieter without going softer. "When something is yours, you work for it. That is how I see it." Hugh Ralston looked at this woman sitting across from him at her kitchen table in the gray autumn light. This woman who re-roofed her own barn and fixed strangers' gate hinges and planted winter vegetables, and talked about ownership with a quiet ferocity that he recognized, because he had felt it himself about his own land for the better part of his life. And he thought, with a kind of helpless clarity, that he was in a considerable amount of trouble. He rode home in the gathering dusk and had a lengthy internal argument with himself that lasted well into the evening and resolved nothing. Walt Briggs came over on Sunday, and they played cards the way they did most Sundays, with Walt's long legs stretched under the kitchen table and a lamp between them and the wind beginning to come in colder off the north. Walt was 42, a widower with 2 grown daughters who had married off and moved to different counties, and he had the comfortable, easy company of a man who has known you long enough to not need to explain yourself to. "You are distracted," Walt said, laying down his hand. "I am playing cards," Hugh said. "You are sitting near cards," Walt said. "You have lost 4 hands in a row, and you bid twice against yourself on that last one." Hugh said nothing. "Is it a woman?" Walt said with the equanimity of a man who has seen everything. "Mind your business," Hugh said. "That is a yes," Walt said, and picked up his coffee with every appearance of satisfaction. Hugh put his cards down. "She bought the Devers place," he said. "The Langston woman," Walt said. "You know her." "I know of her," Walt said. She came by my south fence last month to tell me 2 of my steers had gotten through a gap and were heading toward the creek. She had already driven them back through the gap and wedged a fence post in it temporarily. By the time I got there, she was gone. He paused. I thought that was interesting. She does that, Hugh said. She fixes things. And you find this ruinous, Walt said. I did not say that. You did not have to, Walt said, looking at him with a mild, knowing sympathy that Hugh found both helpful and irritating in equal measure. Hugh, it has been 5 years. I know how long it has been, Hugh said. Clara Hennessy married the Austin man and lives in a brick house, and by all accounts is perfectly comfortable, Walt said. She was not the right woman. That does not mean there is no right woman. I am not looking for a right woman, Hugh said. Apparently, Walt said, she is fixing your fences without being asked, which means the looking may not be the operative issue. Hugh stared at him. Play your cards, Walt said pleasantly. The following week, Hugh found himself on the creek road 3 times, once delivering fence wire that he genuinely had spare of, and that she genuinely needed, once because he had spotted one of her hens loose on the road and returned it, and once because he had made a pot of venison stew that was too large for one person, and he had told himself this was practical and not at all what it plainly was. She took the fence wire, and the hen with the same direct gratitude she gave everything. She accepted the stew and gave him back the pot 2 days later with dried apple preserves in the bottom of a small jar sitting inside it, because she had found a good stand of wild apples down the creek and put them up, and that was that. He ate the preserves on cornbread and thought they were the best thing he had tasted in years, which told him considerably more about his state of mind than it told him about the preserves. October deepened, and the cattle needed moving to the south pasture, and Hugh worked long days that left him tired in a clean, useful way. But he found the evenings longer than they used to be, found himself sitting on his porch after supper looking east along the creek road with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand, and that was a new thing. He had been comfortable in his evenings before. He had not noticed the quiet as anything other than quiet. He noticed it now. Elsie Langston came by his property on a Thursday in the 2nd week of October, which was the first time she had come to him rather than him going to her, and the fact of this registered in his chest like the first warm day after a long cold. She came up the lane in the early afternoon, walking with that straight, purposeful stride, her canvas bag over her shoulder. "The well rope you gave me," she said, when he came out to meet her on the porch. "It is the right weight, but I need to know what kind of well wheel you have on the Briggs place. Walt said you had ordered parts from the hardware and that you might know the supplier." "Come in," he said. "I have the order form." She came in. It was the first time she had been inside his house, and he saw her look around at it with the same frank and observant attention she gave everything, taking in the clean but sparse kitchen, the good stone fireplace he had rebuilt himself, the shelves with their orderly row of a working man's library which included a worn Bible, a copy of Blackstone's commentaries that had been his father's, and 3 years' worth of Stockman's almanacs. She did not comment on any of it, but he had the sense that she had filed it all away. He found the order form, and she wrote down the supplier's name and address with a small pencil she produced from her coat pocket. Her handwriting was clear and practical, no flourishes, no waste. "Would you like coffee?" he said. She looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said. "Thank you." They sat at his kitchen table this time instead of hers, and the conversation moved differently than it had before, with a slightly different quality of ease, as though each exchange had been adding to something without either of them formally deciding to. She told him about the east pasture fence posts she had been replacing, and he told her about the cattle moved to the south pasture, and they talked about the winter coming and whether the almanac was right about hard freezes before December. And somewhere in the middle of all of this, he realized that he was laughing at something she had said, something dry and unexpected about the stubbornness of a particular fence post that had required 3 separate approaches before she had gotten it out of the ground. And the laugh came out of him naturally and unguarded the way it had not in a long time. She was looking at him when the laugh settled, with an expression that was new. Something open in it, something that had not been there before, or that had been there but turned inward and not toward him. The afternoon light was coming in low and golden through the west window, and it was in her hair and on her hands on the table, and Hugh Ralston looked at this woman and thought, with complete and terrible clarity, that he had been lying to himself for weeks. "Elsie," he said. He stopped. "Hugh," she said, with the same simple weight. There was a long pause. Outside the window, a crow called from the cottonwood. The fire in the stove ticked quietly. "I want to be straightforward with you," he said, because he was a man who had found that indirectness cost more than it saved. "I appreciate that," she said, watching him. "I have been finding reasons to come over to your place," he said, "and I think you may have noticed that." She was quiet for a moment. "I noticed," she said. "That is not something I have done in a long time," he said, "or intended to do." "Why not?" she said, and the question was genuine, not a social prompt but an actual inquiry, the way she asked everything. He was quiet for a moment, deciding how honest to be. He had found, over the past weeks, that the kind of careful social calculation he usually applied to conversations did not seem to function well with her, because she met directness with directness and evasion with a patient waiting silence that was worse. "A woman left," he said, 5 years ago. I decided after that I was not going to repeat the experience." She received this information with the same steadiness with which she received everything. "That sounds like a reasonable conclusion at the time," she said. "It did to me," he said. "What conclusion does it sound like now?" she said. He looked at her. "Now it sounds like something I decided before I knew about apple preserves in the bottom of a pot," he said, and he had not planned to say it, but it came out with an honesty that seemed, in the moment, like the only useful thing. She was still watching him, and the expression on her face had shifted again, that small movement like a change in the angle of light, and now he could see something in her eyes that was quiet and warm and a little careful, the expression of a person who wants something but has trained herself not to want things easily. "I came from San Antonio alone," she said slowly. "I bought that property alone. I have been working it alone. That was my plan." She paused. "I made that plan for the same kinds of reasons you made yours." "Someone left," he said. "Someone stayed, but in the wrong way, which is sometimes worse," she said, and there was something in her voice that was brief and honest and that she did not expand on, but that he understood or understood enough of. "I see," he said. They sat in the kitchen with the gold afternoon light on the table between them and the enormity of what was not quite being said filling the room in a way that was not uncomfortable exactly, but was very full. "I am not asking you for anything," he said finally. "I am just telling you that it is true, so that you know." She nodded slowly. "I know it," she said. "I have known it." A pause. "It has been sitting in my mind too." He said nothing, because he did not know what to say to that, and she seemed to understand this because she stood and picked up her canvas bag and put her pencil away and said, "Thank you for the coffee," in a voice that was the same as always and also somehow entirely different. "Thank you for coming by," he said. She went out, and he stood on the porch and watched her go down the lane in the falling afternoon, and this time, about halfway to the road, she stopped and turned and looked back at him. She did not wave or call out. She just looked at him for a moment, and then she turned and walked on, and he watched her until she was out of sight. He leaned against the porch post for a long time after that. Walt Briggs found him on Friday morning checking the south fence line and rode alongside him for half a mile before saying anything, which was one of the things Hugh valued most about Walt's company. "She came by your place," Walt said eventually. "She needed a supplier name," Hugh said. Walt said. "I told her how I felt," Hugh said without preamble. Walt looked at him sideways. "How did that go?" "She told me she has been thinking about it too," Hugh said. Walt was quiet for a moment. "Well," he said. "That is good." "It is terrifying," Hugh said. "Yes," Walt agreed. It generally is. That is more or less how you know it is real. He looked out over the pasture where the cattle were moving slow and comfortable in the morning sun. What are you going to do about it? I do not know yet, Hugh said. You could start by asking her to supper, Walt said. That seems fast, Hugh said. Walt looked at him with a gentle incredulity that said, clearly, that a man who has been manufacturing reasons to visit a woman's property twice a week for a month is not in any position to describe things as moving too fast. He did not say this. He did not need to. Hugh asked her to supper. He rode over on Saturday morning and found her splitting wood behind the house, which she did with the same efficient competence she brought to everything, the axe moving clean and certain through the logs, and he stood at the corner of the house and asked if she would come to supper on Wednesday. She set the axe head on the block and looked at him. Wednesday, she said. If that suits you, he said. She considered it with her full attention, the way she considered everything, and then said, that suits me fine. He walked back to his horse with a feeling in his chest that was entirely out of proportion to the exchange, and he did not try to argue himself out of it this time. Wednesday came with the particular quality of clear autumn days that seem lit from inside, the sky a deep blue and the air sharp and clean, and the cottonwoods along the creek turning yellow at the edges. He spent most of Tuesday preparing, which involved considerable more thought about food than he usually gave it, and also the polishing of his best lamp, which needed it, and the arranging and rearranging of the kitchen table, which told him things about himself he found somewhat alarming. She arrived at the agreed time, which was sundown, and she had changed from her work clothes into a plain wool dress of dark blue that he had not seen her in before, and her hair was down instead of tied back, and she looked so entirely different, and yet so entirely herself that he stood in the doorway for a moment longer than was smooth. Hugh, she said. Elsie, he said, come in. He had made a proper supper, venison roast with root vegetables and cornbread, things he could do well, and he had found a bottle of wine that had been in the back of his pantry, from some occasion he could not now remember, and they sat at his kitchen table with the lamp between them and ate, and talked the way they had been talking for weeks now, but with a new quality to it, like a room you have been in before but now with all the lamps lit. She talked about her father's ranch outside Lockhart, the cattle work she had learned there as a girl, the way she had managed more of it than most people knew because her father's health had been failing for years before his death. She talked about it plainly and without self-pity, but he could hear underneath it the story of a person who had been carrying things alone for a very long time and had made a certain peace with that. He told her about his father, about the building of the Ralston ranch from borrowed money and hard years, about the pride of the thing and the weight of it. He told her carefully about Clara, more than he had told Walt or anyone, not as a wound to display, but as a truth that was part of how he had come to be sitting here, at this table, at 34 years old, with this woman across from him. She listened in the complete way she did everything. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment and then said, I am glad she went. He looked at her. Not for your pain, she said. I am sorry for that, but if she had stayed, you would not be here at this table with me. She said it with her usual directness, but there was something underneath it, something that was not quite shy but was close to it, a rare, unguarded thing. I am glad too, he said. Now, I was not glad then. No, she said. That is how it usually works. They washed up after supper together, which was a small domestic thing that somehow felt more intimate than the conversation over the table had been, standing at his wash basin in the lamplight with the water warm, and the evening outside very dark and still. She handed him things to dry without ceremony, and he dried them and put them away, and it was very quiet and very comfortable, and he was almost afraid to say anything in case it disturbed something. He walked her to the lane afterward, and they stood in the dark under the enormous sky, the stars thick and brilliant the way they were on clear cold autumn nights in central Texas, and she looked up at them for a moment, and then at him. I had a good evening, she said. I am glad, he said. "So did I." She looked at him in the darkness, and he could see the starlight on her face, and he thought about kissing her with the same clear and helpless certainty with which he had been thinking about being ruined since the first morning he saw her fixing his gate. He did not do it. He was not a man who moved without being sure. "Good night, Hugh," she said. "Good night, Elsie," he said. She walked down the lane and he watched her go, and this time she did not turn around, but she raised one hand briefly as she reached the road, a small gesture, just acknowledging that he was still there, and then she was gone into the dark. He stood under the stars for a long time. November came in cold and honest. There were frosts in the mornings now, white across the grass, the kind that burned off by mid-morning but left the whole world looking scrubbed and new. Hugh's cattle were fat and settled on the south pasture, and the winter preparations were mostly complete, which meant he had more time than he usually allowed himself, and he spent a portion of that time on the East Creek Road, and a portion of it thinking about Elsie Langston in a way that was no longer something he tried to argue with. They had fallen into a rhythm that had come about naturally and without particular planning, the way a path forms through a field where two people keep walking. He came by 2 or 3 times a week, sometimes with a practical reason and sometimes without one. She came to his place once a week, sometimes more. They worked on things together sometimes, fence posts and winterproofing and the like, and they talked while they worked, and the conversations ranged over more territory every time. He learned that she was 28 years old, that she had taught herself to read from her father's Bible, and then everything else she could find, that she had strong opinions about crop rotation and weaker but still present opinions about literature, that she was afraid of almost nothing physical but found social gatherings in large groups slightly uncomfortable, that she could read a weather sky as well as any rancher, and that she took her coffee black and did not understand people who did not. She learned him, too, in the same careful and thorough way she learned everything. She learned his silences, the productive ones and the worried ones. She learned which problems he liked to talk through, and which ones he needed to sit with first. She learned that he was more sentimental than he appeared, that he had kept his father's Blackstone not because he ever read it but because of the handwriting in the margins. She learned that he was a man of his word in a way that went all the way down, not as a performance, but as a habit of character so deep it was simply the shape of him. It was in the second week of November that he kissed her, and it was not planned. They had been sitting on his porch in the early evening, the cold coming in but neither of them in a hurry to go in, with coffee cups going cool in their hands, and the last of the sunset doing something extraordinary over the western ridge, all orange and deep pink, and the kind of gold that makes you feel you should say something about it, but you never can because no words are quite right for it. She had been telling him something about the root cellar door she had finally got to fit properly, and she had turned to look at him and say something, and he had turned to look at her at the same moment, and they were close, closer than the space of the conversation required, and she stopped mid-sentence and he stopped watching the sunset, and they looked at each other in the last of the orange light. He said, "Elsie." She said nothing, just looked at him, and the expression on her face was the one he had been slowly learning, the one with the warmth underneath the steadiness, the one that was not easy but was real. He kissed her. It was not a rushed thing. It was the kind of kiss that happens when two people have been moving toward each other for weeks, and the actual arrival is both surprising and completely inevitable, careful and warm, and honest in a way that matched everything else about the two of them. She kissed him back, and her hand came up and rested against his chest, not pushing away, just placing itself there as though checking that he was real. When they separated, she looked at him with those steady brown eyes and the smile that she gave rarely and meant fully, and he felt something in his chest that was large and warm and clear, and that he had decided he was never going to feel again. He had been wrong about that. "Hugh Ralston," she said softly. "Elsie Langston," he said. She laughed, a quiet private laugh, and leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat on his porch in the gathering dark with the stars coming out and the cold air around them, and it was the most comfortable Hugh had been in 5 years, possibly longer. Walt Briggs came over on Sunday with a knowing expression that he was making no effort to conceal, and Hugh told him with a dignity that was only partially undercut by the fact that he could not stop the corner of his mouth from doing what it was doing. "She is a good woman," Walt said. "A serious woman. Treats her property like it matters. Treats her word like it matters." He paused. "She is the right one. I have thought so since the day she drove my cattle back through the fence." "You barely know her," Hugh said. "I know enough," Walt said, "and you know the rest." Hugh did not argue with this because it was true. December arrived with a hard freeze that came down from the north without much warning and caught everyone's water lines short. Hugh spent 2 days dealing with the consequences on his own property, and then rode straight to Elsie's without stopping to think about whether he was being presumptuous. She had her root cellar issues managed and the water situation mostly sorted by the time he arrived, because she was that kind of person, but she accepted his help with the South Pasture water trough without any of the careful independence she had shown in the earlier weeks. That was a change he had noticed. The self-sufficiency was not gone, would never be gone. It was too much a part of her character, but the insistence on managing entirely alone had softened. She let him help in the way that a person who has always done everything alone gradually learns to trust that help offered freely is not the same as dependence, and the learning of it was a thing he watched with a kind of quiet reverence. He found himself, on a cold December morning with the ice cracking on the water trough and their breath making clouds in the air, thinking about the future in a way he had not thought about it in a long time. Not vaguely, specifically. He did not say anything yet. He was not a man who said things before he was sure they were right. Christmas in Calhoun County in 1883 was celebrated with the modest ceremony appropriate to working people in a small cattle town. The community held a gathering at the church on Christmas Eve, and Hugh went, as he went every year, and this year he went with Elsie at his side, and the fact of this was noted by everyone and commented on by several. And Gideon Marvell at the general store gave Hugh a look of profound satisfaction when they came in together afterward for peppermint candy that had no relation whatsoever to business. She wore the dark blue dress she had worn to his kitchen that first supper, and her hair was up, and she stood next to him in the church with her shoulder against his, and sang the carols with a clear, true voice he had not heard before, and that moved something in him. He could feel her warmth against his side in the cold church, and he thought, standing there in the candlelight with the singing of the community around them, that he had been a very foolish man to decide he was done with this. He had not been done. He had only been afraid. After Christmas dinner, which they shared at his place along with Walt and 2 of the older ranch families from down the road, in the long, easy way of country Christmas where the meal lasts 3 hours and the conversation longer, he walked her home along the creek road in the winter dark, the frost bright on the ground and the stars brilliant and cold above. At her gate, which swung true on its hinges, she stopped and turned to him. "This has been the best Christmas I have had in years," she said. "Maybe the best one." "For me too," he said without any qualification. She looked at him in the darkness and then said quietly, "I am not afraid of this, Hugh. I want you to know that. I was careful coming into it, but I am not afraid." He looked at her. He took her hands, which were cold through the gloves, and held them. "Neither am I," he said. "Not any more." She squeezed his hands once and then went through her gate and up her lane to her house, and the door opened and the lamplight spilled out warm and gold, and she went in. He walked home under the stars and was not afraid. The new year came in with rain and mud, and the particular unglamorous labor of late January cattle work, calving season beginning in the cold and requiring attention at all hours. Hugh was up before dawn most mornings and falling asleep by 8 at night, and he saw less of Elsie during that period, but found that the missing of her had a different quality than it might have had 2 months earlier. It was not anxious. It was warm. It was something he could carry with him through a long, cold calving morning and find still there, unchanged, when he climbed back on his horse at dusk. She came by with food sometimes during that stretch, appearing at his door with a pot of something hot in the early evenings when the light was going, the way neighbors had always done for each other in country, where everyone understood that there were times when cooking was the last thing a person had the energy for. She did not stay long on those evenings, just handed over the pot and asked how the calving was going and listened to the answer with her full attention, and then went home to her own work. He appreciated the food. He appreciated more than he could easily say the quality of her attention, the fact that she asked how the calving was going and meant it, and knew what the answer meant, and did not offer comfort that minimized the work. In the third week of February, the calving was done, and the weather broke, and there was a day that felt almost like spring, warm and golden and impossible. One of those Texas days in late winter that are a lie the weather tells you, but a beautiful one. He rode over to her place in the mid-afternoon and found her at the far end of the east pasture, walking the fence line she had finished replacing in the autumn, checking it the way a person does at winter's end, making sure the frost heave had not shifted anything. He got down from his horse and walked the fence line with her, and she put her hand in his as they walked, easy and natural, and they went along the whole east boundary in the gold afternoon light, saying very little, and it was one of the best afternoons of his life. "I want to ask you something," he said, when they reached the corner post and turned back toward the house. She looked at him. "I want to ask it right," he said. Not rushed, not careless. She was quiet, watching him with those steady eyes that he had been reading for months now and that were, right now, very still and very open. "I know you came here to build something that is yours," he said. "I know that mattered, I know it still does. I'm not asking you to give that up. I'm asking whether you would consider building something that is also ours." There was a pause, a long one, the kind that is not hesitation exactly but the intake of breath before something real. "Hugh Ralston," she said. "Elsie Langston," he said. She looked at him for a long moment, and the smile came, the full one, the rare one, and it was worth every cold morning and every fence post and every sensible resolution he had ever made and broken. "Yes," she said, "I would consider that very seriously." He kissed her in the south pasture of the Devers property with the warm fall spring sun on both of them, and the fence they had just walked running clean and true to the corner. And it was not the first time he had kissed her, but it was the first time he had kissed her knowing what it meant in full, and the difference was enormous. They were married in April. It was a small ceremony at the church in Calhoun, which was the way both of them wanted it, without fuss or performance. Walt Briggs stood up with Hugh and Gideon Marvell, and his wife Sarah stood for Elsie, because they had become genuine friends over the winter, Elsie coming into the store for supplies and Gideon dispensing information freely, and Sarah proving to be a person of sharp intelligence and dry humor that Elsie appreciated. The congregation was the community they had both been part of, the ranch families and the townspeople and the old neighbors, and it was a ceremony that lasted the right amount of time and said the right things, and ended with Hugh Ralston kissing his wife in front of everyone on a fine April morning with the Texas wildflowers coming up outside the church windows. The reception was at his ranch, which was now also her ranch, the Ralston place. She had moved her things over in March, which had taken 2 wagon trips because she traveled light, and had come to the house with a quiet purposefulness that was entirely her own, and had spent the first day arranging things with a practical efficiency that made it clear she was not a guest. She was home. He had found that watching her move through his house, their house, as though she belonged in it, which she utterly did, was something he kept needing to stop and acknowledge, because the gratitude of it was large. The Devers property they leased to a young couple who had just come up from San Marcos, newly married themselves and looking for a start. Elsie had been firm that the property should not sit empty and should go to someone who would work it properly, and she interviewed both the man and the woman before agreeing, because she was exactly that kind of person, and Hugh sat in the corner and let her conduct the business with the quiet amusement and admiration of a man who is very glad to be married to who he is married to. The spring and summer of 1884 were good ones on the Ralston ranch. The winter calves were growing well, and the grass was strong, and Hugh and Elsie worked the place with a shared effort that felt, almost from the beginning, like something they had been doing for years. She knew cattle work. She knew land work. She had strong opinions about which pastures to rotate to and the wisdom of putting in a proper kitchen garden behind the main house, which she did in May, and which produced abundantly by July and continued producing through October the way she had known it would. They had their disagreements, because they were both strong-headed people who knew their own minds, and disagreements between two people like that are inevitable and can be either corrosive or healthy depending on the people. With Hugh and Elsie they were healthy, the kind that are argued plainly and resolved honestly and left behind, because neither of them had the appetite for anything else. He found in those first months of marriage that the decision he had made 5 years ago on the porch after Clara left, the decision to be finished, had been the decision of a man protecting a wound rather than the decision of a man who knew himself. What he had taken for the recognition that he was not built for this kind of thing was actually just grief talking. The grief had been real. The conclusion it had produced had not been. He thought about this on a summer evening in July, sitting on the porch with Elsie beside him in the long blue dusk, her feet up on the porch rail and her hair down, and a book open in her lap that she was not currently reading. The ranch was quiet and the cattle were settled and everything was as it should be. She turned her head and looked at him as if she had felt him thinking. "What is it?" she said. "Nothing bad," he said. "I was thinking about how wrong I was about something." "About what?" she said. He looked at her in the evening light, at the woman who had fixed his gait without introducing herself and walked away without looking back and ruined him completely and permanently and well, and thought that some things were too large to say exactly right. "About being done," he said. She understood this because she understood him. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "So was I." He took her hand and they sat in the dusk and the ranch settled around them, their ranch, the one they were building together, and the evening came in warm and full. In the autumn of 1884, Elsie told him she was expecting a child. She told him the way she told him everything, directly and without drama, across the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning over coffee, looking at him with those steady eyes and that small precautionary stillness that he had learned meant she was watching to see how he received something important. He looked at her for a moment and then something happened in his face that he could not have described and probably did not need to, because whatever it was sufficient. She smiled. He came around the table and held her for a long moment, and he felt her arms go around him and they stood in the kitchen in the Tuesday morning quiet, and he felt the future in front of them like good land in the first light, all of it there, all of it waiting. He pulled back and looked at her. "How do you feel?" "Like myself mostly," she said. "Tired in the mornings, but myself." "We will need to talk about what you can and cannot manage," he said. She looked at him with the particular expression of a woman who has been managing things entirely alone since she was very young and is now weighing how to respond to that sentence. He saw the expression. "I will say it differently," he said. "We will talk about what we need to do differently, together." The expression shifted. "Better," she said. The pregnancy was an ordinary one in all the important ways. No complications in the early months, and Elsie continued to work the ranch with the sensible adjustments of a practical woman who knows her body and her limits, which were honestly assessed and honestly respected. Hugh watched over her with a care that he tried to make useful rather than smothering, though she had to redirect him once or twice in November when he started to shade into the latter. "I am carrying a child," she said on one of those occasions with great patience. "I am not made of glass. I have been doing hard work my entire life. I will tell you when I need things adjusted." "I know it," he said. "I know you will." "Then let me do it," she said. He did. Walt Briggs was quietly delighted at the news, in the way of a man who has been watching two people build something good and is pleased to see it continuing. He came over more often in those months, with the same ease he always had, but with something slightly warmer and more attentive in it, the way an older neighbor becomes more present when there is new life arriving in the community. Christmas of 1884 was different from the one before, fuller in a way that went beyond the physical. Elsie was visibly expecting by then, and she wore it with the same unself-conscious directness she wore everything, not performing it or retreating from it, but simply being a woman who is going to have a child and has work to do in the meantime. The community gathering at the church was warm and close, the way it was in a small cattle county where everyone's business is in some sense shared business. And there were people who remembered Hugh Ralston in the years after Clara left, quiet and closed and going about his work with a kind of contained emptiness, who looked at him standing in the Christmas candlelight with his wife's hand in his, and saw the difference without needing it explained. Gideon Marvell shook Hugh's hand with both of his on Christmas Eve and said, "You look like yourself, the real yourself." I did not know if we would see that again, and Hugh, who was not a man given to easy display, found that this required him to look at the floor for a moment. The baby came in March of 1885, on a cold, clear morning with frost on the grass outside, and the first light just coming up red over the eastern ridge. It was a boy, healthy and loud about it from the first moment, with dark hair and a grip on Hugh's finger that seemed to comment on the rest of his life as a whole. They named him James, for Hugh's father, and the name had a weight and a rightness to it that settled over the morning like the settling of something long awaited. Elsie held the baby in the clean morning light with an expression that was a new one on her, soft and fierce at once, and she looked at Hugh over the baby's head with those brown eyes that he had been reading for a year and a half now and that were, in this moment, completely undone and completely unguarded, and he loved her with a completeness that had no reservation in it. "James Ralston," she said softly, looking at the baby. "James Ralston," Hugh agreed. Walt came over that afternoon and held the baby with the practiced ease of a man who had raised children himself, and stood in the kitchen looking at Hugh over the small dark-haired head with the expression of a man whose point made long ago has been very thoroughly proved. "I said she was the right one," Walt said. "You said that in October of '83, Hugh said. "I was correct in October of '83, Walt said. He was. The spring of 1885 came in like all good springs do, gradually and then all at once, the grass coming back green and full, the wildflowers moving up through the pastures, the whole country shaking off winter. Hugh worked the ranch, and Elsie, when James was old enough to be safely near the kitchen, worked alongside him again, the baby in a wooden carrier that she wore on her back and that James seemed to find entirely agreeable, looking around at the world from his perch with an expression of general interest. The Ralston ranch grew that year. Hugh purchased the water rights to the North Creek section that had come available when the Harmon family sold up and moved to New Mexico, which extended the summer grazing considerably. They bought 20 additional head of good cattle from a rancher down in Bixar County who was reducing his herd, and by the end of summer the Ralston operation was the most solid it had been since the early years of Hugh's father. Elsie had also, in her systematic and determined way, made the ranch more itself in the ways that she brought to it. The kitchen garden was a proper one now, with a root cellar she had dug and lined herself in the spring, and the household ran with the same organized efficiency she brought to everything. She had also, quietly and without fanfare, repaired every gate, every fence post, every sagging hinge on the entire property, which Hugh discovered incrementally over the course of the year, finding things fixed that he had meant to fix and had not quite gotten to. He told her this one evening, after finding the smokehouse door had been rehung while he was moving cattle. "You cannot stop fixing things," he said, "even now." "Things needed fixing," she said with complete equanimity. "I know," he said, "but you do not have to do them all alone anymore. That is what I am saying." She looked at him. "I know I do not have to," she said, But I like the work I always have." He thought about this. "All right," he said, "but if you are going to rehang my smokehouse door, I would like to know about it so I can hand you things." She looked at him for a long moment, and then a real smile came, the full one, the rare one. "That," she said, "would be acceptable." They worked side by side in the following weeks on every repair on the list that she had been quietly maintaining in her head. And it was some of the best work Hugh had ever done, not because it was hard work, but because of who he was doing it with. In the summer of 1886, Elsie told him across the Tuesday morning coffee table that there was going to be another child, and this time she was smiling before she even finished the sentence, because she knew what his face was going to do and she wanted to see it. It did not disappoint. The second child was a girl, born in February of 1887 on a rainy evening with the fire going in the main room and the sound of the rain on the cypress roof. They named her Clara, not for anyone named Clara, but because Elsie had always liked the name, and Hugh found that the name, which had once carried a considerable weight, now felt entirely clean and new in the context of this small brown-eyed daughter who looked at both her parents from the beginning with an expression of great thoughtfulness. James was 2 years old when his sister arrived and received her with the furrowed interest of a toddler confronting a fact he had not been adequately prepared for. But by the end of the week, he had appointed himself a position of unofficial oversight that he maintained with considerable seriousness. Walt Briggs was present for most of this. Not just the arrivals, but the daily fabric of it. The Sunday card games that now happened with James asleep in the other room and later with him awake and attempting to participate. The meals that were now larger and louder. The porch evenings that were now sometimes accompanied by small persons needing to be carried in at dark. He was the closest thing to a grandfather those children had, and he occupied the role with a deep and evident pleasure that made Hugh grateful in ways he did not always have the right words for. He said so one evening in the summer of 1887, when the two of them were sitting on the porch after supper with Elsie inside putting the children to bed and the ranch quiet around them and the stars coming up. "I do not say it enough," Hugh said, "what it has meant, you being here." Walt looked at him. He was quiet for a moment in the way of a man who does not need thanks but does not dismiss it either. "I have been watching over you since your father died," Walt said, "or trying to. There were years it was not easy to do." "I know," Hugh said. "You had shut yourself down," Walt said. "Not entirely, but enough." He looked out at the dark ranch, the pastures and the fence lines and the good solid shape of the land. "She opened it again, Elsie did, without even trying from what I could see. She fixed my gate," Hugh said, and there was a quality in his voice that was quiet and warm and entirely certain. Walt smiled. "She fixed your gate," he said, "and did not even introduce herself." "And I was ruined," Hugh said. "From that morning, I did not know it yet, but I was." They sat in the comfortable silence of two men who have known each other through the hard years and the good ones, with the summer night around them and the sound of Elsie's voice, soft and even, coming through the open window, reading to James before sleep. The years after that had the quality of a life that has found its shape. The Ralston ranch continued to grow, not rapidly but steadily, in the manner of something built on solid ground. By 1889, they had the North Creek section fully incorporated and a small hired hand, a young man named Pete Garza from San Antonio, who worked with a willingness and competence that Elsie had identified in his first week, and Hugh had confirmed over the following months. Pete Garza was 20 years old, the son of a vaquero family who had been working Texas ranches for 3 generations, and he knew cattle work the way some people know a language, instinctively and precisely, and he was honest in a way that was evident from the beginning. Elsie had hired him after a conversation at the general store where he had been asking about work, and Hugh, hearing the story, had trusted her judgment, because he had learned by then that her judgment about people was as good as her judgment about fences, which was to say very good indeed. Pete ate supper at the ranch house most evenings, and quickly became part of the daily life of the place in the way that a good hired hand becomes part of the larger family of a working ranch. James adored him completely and followed him at a worshipful distance that Pete bore with a patient good nature. Clara, who was 2 and deeply observant, watched him from a considered distance and eventually decided he was acceptable. The town of Calhoun had grown some by 1889, with a new schoolhouse and a larger general store, and a doctor who had come down from Austin the previous year and set up a practice on the main street. It was still a small cattle town, still fundamentally itself, but the territory was changing, the frontier era drawing in at the edges, the wildness of it becoming something more settled. Hugh had watched this with the mixed feelings of a man who has always lived at this edge, who understood both what was being gained and what was being lost as the land was civilized. He and Elsie talked about it sometimes on the porch evenings, in the way they talked about everything honestly and without conclusion, because some things do not have conclusions but only need to be said. "Your father built this from nothing," she said one such evening. "My father too. Everything our fathers built was at the edge of something, and now there are schools and doctors and rail service within a day's ride." "Is that good?" he said. "For James and Clara," she said, "yes. For what we came from, I do not know how to say." She looked out at the pasture, at the fence lines that had been repaired and improved, and that now ran true and strong across the whole property. "I think you can honor what it was and be glad for what is coming. I think it does not have to be one or the other." This was, he thought, the correct thing. It generally was with her. In 1890, the year James turned 5 and Clara turned 3, Elsie Ralston fixed the gate at the end of the south pasture with exactly the same methodical competence with which she had fixed Hugh Ralston's gate 7 years before. He watched her from the back of his horse, having ridden up without her hearing him, and she was crouched in the same position, the same focused attention, the same economy of movement, the hammer coming down clean and certain on the pin. When she stood and tested the gate, swinging it once, twice, latching it, she turned and found him there, and she looked at him with an expression that held everything they had been through together, all 7 years of it, the beginning and the middle and the daily fabric of the long good present. "That hinge was pulling loose," she said. "I know," he said. "I was going to get to it." The corner of her mouth moved. "I know," she said, "but I had the iron and the time." He got down from his horse and walked to her and kissed her beside the fixed gate in the autumn morning, with the frost on the grass and the light coming up gold over the ridge, and she kissed him back with the full and uncalculating warmth of a woman who had nothing left to be careful about. "7 years," he said when they stepped apart. "7 years," she agreed. "You did not introduce yourself," he said. "I was there to fix a hinge," she said. "You ruined me," he said. She looked up at him with those brown eyes that he had been reading and loving and learning for 7 years, and she said, with a precision that was entirely her, "You were already mostly rotten before I got there. I just fixed the part that needed it." He laughed, a real laugh, a large one, the kind that comes from deep in the chest and means everything is all right, and she laughed too, her own laughter, the rare full one, the one that made everything around it brighter. He took her hand and they walked back up the lane toward the house, where they could already hear James's voice rising with some urgent morning question and Clara's smaller counterpoint, and Pete Garza somewhere in the barn doing the morning work, and the kitchen fire going and the smell of coffee on the air, and the whole day ahead of them on their land, their good land, the land they had built and fixed and were building still. Walt Briggs came over that Sunday as he always did, and the card game was loud and interrupted and lasted until nearly 10 at night, because James had figured out how to stay awake past his bedtime by asking questions at strategic intervals, and Clara had figured out that if James got to stay up then she could make a compelling case for the same. And it was after both children were finally asleep and Pete had gone to the bunkhouse, and the lamp was low on the kitchen table, that the 3 of them sat with the last of the coffee and the night very quiet outside. "What are you thinking?" Walt said to Hugh. Hugh looked at his wife, who was looking back at him over her coffee cup, and he thought about the gate on a Tuesday morning in the autumn of 1883, and the woman who had fixed it and walked away without a word, and the feeling in his chest that had started small and quiet and impossible to name, and had never, not once in 7 years, gone smaller or quieter or easier to name. "I am thinking," he said, "that I was a very foolish man to decide I was done." "You were," Walt agreed pleasantly. "And I am thinking," Hugh said, still looking at Elsie, "that the best things that ever happened to me came from being wrong." Elsie set her coffee cup down and looked at him with the full weight of her attention, which was the same full weight it had always been, the same steady brown eyes that had seen him clearly from the beginning and had chosen him anyway, that chose him still every day with the same quiet and absolute certainty with which she fixed everything that needed fixing. "You are not wrong anymore," she said. "No," he agreed. "I am not." The lamp burned low between them and outside the window. The stars were enormous and close over the Texas dark, and the ranch was quiet with the deep settled quiet of a place that is cared for and known. And Hugh Ralston, who had promised himself once on a lonely porch that he was finished with love, sat in his kitchen with his wife and his oldest friend and the living proof of everything he had been wrong about, and was grateful, in a way too large and clear to require any words. For the morning a woman had knelt by his broken gate with a hammer and a piece of iron and fixed it without looking up. He had not deserved the fixing. He had tried, every day since, to be worth it. He thought, looking at Elsie's face in the lamplight, that he was getting there. She seemed to think so too. James Ralston turned 6 in the spring of 1891 and started at the new schoolhouse in Calhoun, riding in on a small brown mare that his father had picked out for him the previous autumn and that James had named Dust for reasons that remained private. He was a serious boy with a laugh that surprised you when it came, like his father, and he had his mother's eyes and his mother's particular quality of attention, which meant that when he looked at you he was actually looking at you, and this caused his schoolteacher, a young woman from Austin named Miss Holt, to describe him in her first letter home as the most observant child in the class. Elsie read this letter at the kitchen table and looked at Hugh with a small and private satisfaction, and he raised an eyebrow at her, and she said, "He gets that from somewhere," and he said, "He does," and they both knew perfectly well where it came from. Clara was 4 and did not yet go to school, but showed every indication of being impatient about this state of affairs. She was her mother in miniature in a way that was sometimes startling, the same directness, the same competence with her small hands, the same economy of expression that could communicate entire paragraphs with a look. She followed Elsie around the ranch with focused attention and demanded to be taught everything, and Elsie taught her, the way her own father had taught her, straightforwardly and completely, not managing what she shared because of the child's age but because of the child's understanding, which was considerable. Hugh watched his daughter learn to identify which fence posts were going soft from the ground up, watched her stand beside her mother in the kitchen garden, and learn the names of every plant and their needs, watched her with the deep and somewhat overwhelming feeling of a man who is witness to something continuing past himself, something being handed on. He thought about his own father, about the Blackstone on the shelf with the handwriting in the margins, about the ranch built from borrowed money and hard years. He thought about Elsie's father, the rancher outside Lockhart who had taught his daughter cattle work and practical knowledge, and the deep understanding that what you build is yours and you protect it and you work for it, and it becomes part of you. He thought about what he and Elsie were building, not just the land and the cattle and the fence lines, but the other thing, the thing you build when two people who have both been alone come together and choose each other every day. The thing that is made of mornings and suppers and arguments resolved, and compromises reached and hands held on winter evenings and laughter on summer porches, and the small domestic miracle of 2 lives that have become one life without either of them being diminished. He thought he was the luckiest man in Calhoun County, Texas. He might have been the luckiest man in Texas. He was not going to argue the point. On a clear October morning in 1891, 8 years to the season from the morning he had stood at his kitchen window and watched a woman he did not know fix his gate, Hugh Ralston walked the full perimeter of the Ralston ranch with his wife at his side. It was a thing they had started doing in the springs and falls, a proper walking survey of the whole property, fence lines and water sources and pasture conditions, the way his father had walked it every season and his father before him. James was at school and Clara was with Walt, who had taken on the role of her devoted audience with great willingness, and Pete was managing the morning work. And so it was just the two of them, walking their land in the autumn light, the air sharp and smelling of dry grass and the promise of the first frost within the week. They walked the North Creek section and the east pasture and the south pasture and the long fence line along the creek road, and they talked about what needed doing before winter and what they might expand in the spring, and whether it was time to think about improving the barn, which Elsie thought it was, and Hugh was coming around too. They talked about James and the school and Clara and her obvious and early opinions about everything. They talked about Walt, who was 60 now and managing fine, but whom they both watched with the quiet attentiveness of people who love someone and know that time moves. They reached the gate at the far end of the property, the original gate, the one she had knelt beside on a Tuesday morning in October of 1883. It was not the same gate. The timber had been replaced twice in 8 years, but the post was original and the position was original, and Hugh stopped when they reached it. He looked at the gate for a moment. Then he looked at her. She was watching him with those steady brown eyes, and she knew what he was thinking because she almost always knew what he was thinking, and she had the small private expression that she kept for the things between them that were too large and too deep for other people's company. "This is where it started," he said. "This is where it started," she agreed. He looked at the gate, the clean solid gate, properly hung, properly latched, swinging true and clear. "You fixed it without introducing yourself," he said. "I was there to fix a hinge," she said, for the third time in 8 years. "And you walked away without looking back," he said. "I had things to get on with," she said. "The first time," he said. "The second time you looked back." She was quiet for a moment. "The second time," she said, "I had already decided I was in trouble." He laughed. "So had I," he said. She took his arm and leaned against his shoulder, and they stood at the gate for a while, in the way you can stand somewhere when you know it is yours and you are not in a hurry, looking out at the pasture and the cottonwoods along the creek and the sky going blue and vast above everything. 8 years, he said. 8 years, she said. 2 children, he said. 2 children, she said. "And counting," she added with a quietness that had a particular quality to it. He turned to look at her. She looked back at him, with a very small and very complete smile. He felt the thing in his chest that had started on a Tuesday morning in 1883, small and quiet and impossible to name, fill up to something enormous and clear and named. He kissed her there at the gate at the end of the south pasture in the clear October morning, with the frost coming and the cottonwoods turning gold and the whole ranch around them and the whole future still ahead. And she kissed him back. And the gate stood solid and true between the pasture and the world, fixed as it had always been, as it would always be, as long as Elsie Langston had iron in her bag and time on her hands and a man who was worth the fixing. Which, it had turned out, he was. He had spent 8 years making sure of it. He intended to spend the rest of them doing the same. The autumn deepened around them, gold and sharp, and they walked back up the lane together, hand in hand, toward home. Their home. The one she had helped him build, starting with a gate she had fixed without being asked and without a word, on a quiet Tuesday morning in the autumn of 1883, when she had ruined him entirely and permanently and better than he had ever been ruined before, or would ever need to be again.